which enable us to relate to what's out there.
Alright, good afternoon, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting contact. Alright, just going to pull a real simple step off on this one today. I'm going to glaze this sunflower orange straight through it and around it, and then hit the petals with a bright medium yellow.
Read all sorts of different texts, but there's something there underlying more. And the idea is there's a conscious mind, the knower, which is that which knows everything that can be known. The contents of consciousness are not the same as consciousness itself. Then there's a dynamical principle, which is the principle of energy, breath, movement, change, which is part of consciousness as well. And being in the flow of that change is joyful. That's why Ananda, Sat Chit Ananda. Joy is part of the ultimate divine mind. We have a very similar model in the Christian Holy Trinity. The official definition of God in the creeds, the various Christian creeds, are really statements of this threefold nature of God. God the Father is the ground of being. In the Old Testament, when God announced himself to Moses, he says, I am that I am, conscious being in the present. God the Son is the Logos, the principle of name and form, through which all things were made. It's like the Platonic realm of forms or ideas or archetypes of all things in nature. And the Spirit is the breath, the principle of energy, change and movement. The principal metaphor in the Holy Trinity is speaking. All these things are metaphorical. Obviously, the ultimate mind is beyond our conception, but we can have metaphors which help us to think about it. And in many traditions, the Hindu one as well, speaking has a particular role as a metaphor. When I'm speaking now, there is, on one hand, there's me, the speaker, and there's two other things involved. There's the speaker, there's the words, which have structure, form, meaning, connection, etc., patterns, definable patterns. They're distinct from each other. There's lots of different possible words. And there's also the breath on which the words are carried. If I weren't breathing out as I spoke, you wouldn't hear anything. If I don't breathe while I think thoughts or have words in my mind, they're just silent in my mind. If I have just breath without words, there's a flow of air, but there's no particular structure or pattern. So you have to have both the flow of energy and the form, which gives structure, meaning and pattern, and the ground of both. And that's the basic model in the Christian tradition and in the Hindu tradition, and there's a very similar model in the Islamic tradition, because David Ben-Sahar shows the parallels in the Buddhist cosmology as well. And so what this is a basic archetype of consciousness that underlies all things. It's reflected in the whole universe. The whole universe has forms, and it has energy. Forms are given by fields, and fields in the standard science are governed by the laws of nature. In my view, they're habits that have a kind of memory. So everything in nature has both a combination of form and energy. An electron, an atom, has form given by principles of quantum field theory, and energy. If it hadn't got the energy, it wouldn't exist. If it hadn't got the form, it wouldn't be a definable entity. It would, even light, which is undifferentiated energy, as undifferentiated as it can get, still has wavelengths. It still has some form or pattern, where light has different wavelengths. So everything has form and energy, and a conscious being underlying it. And that same model would apply to our own consciousness. We have, of course, we need energy. We eat food, we have electrical energy in our nerves, we have form that our bodies take up during embryology. There are patterns of activity in our brains. There's energy flowing through our brains. And some of these patterns of energy and some of these forms become conscious. And our conscious minds are full of all sorts of forms, names and forms. We can form pictures in our dreams. we can see images of things that aren't actually in front of us. There's always a dynamical principle moving in our dreams. So I think that when we ask the question, is the universe conscious, then it's possible to say yes, it could be conscious, and what's more, its consciousness could tell us something about the ultimate source of all consciousness. Everything within the universe could be like fractal versions of this universal consciousness, with a unity of whatever system it is, the grounded being of that system, together with the forms and the energy that make it up. And we can see this as underlying our own mental activity. Now, of course, this leads to all sorts of detailed changes in our brains, which neuroscientists can study. But we're never going to understand the nature of consciousness just through studying brains, because then we get back to the hard problem. You can't just explain consciousness in terms of brain activity. You can find out ever more details about the activity. You can believe, as some materialists believe, that if we go on studying brains long enough, sooner or later the answer to consciousness will just appear. But I think on philosophical grounds that's simply not going to happen. And what we're in at the moment is this fascinating transition point between mechanistic materialism, which works very well for physics, it works very well for making machines, iPhones, televisions, jet aeroplanes and so forth, but it works very badly for explaining consciousness. And spiritual experiences, which many people access through a whole range of spiritual practices, and there's a revival of spiritual practices today. I discussed 7 in each of my 2 recent books, Science and Spiritual Practices and Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work. These spiritual practices are ways in which we can actually get into a closer direct experience with these forms of consciousness beyond the human level. Meditation, although practiced by many people as a way of de-stressing after a busy day, or counteracting anxiety and depression, it's now practiced as a secular well-being type exercise. In the cultures from which it comes, contemplative Christianity, monks and nuns in monasteries, Hindu meditators, Buddhist meditators, Sufi meditators, the people who've done it traditionally in a religious context have done it not just so they're less stressed and they can cope with the stresses of modern life. They've done it because they think that by going into the very ground of consciousness itself, when you go past the ruminations, you cease to identify with the constant flow of thoughts that are going through your mind. You can reach states where you're in a state of awareness, just conscious being. That conscious being puts us in touch with the ground of conscious being on all things. The Hindus like to use an analogy. They say, think of lots of buckets of water at night with the moon, and you can look in each bucket of water, you'll see a reflection of the moon. It looks as if there's hundreds of moons, but actually there's just one moon reflected in all these buckets. And there's one ultimate mind reflected in all conscious beings of the universe, and each one of us, in every conscious animal, in every conscious being of every kind, stars, galaxies, in the entire universe. So that meditation is a practice for getting to the ground of being. So other spiritual practices like music, dancing, and sports, which I think is the most common spiritual practice in the modern world that takes people into altered states of consciousness, especially being in the present. It works quicker and more effectively than meditation. You can't, when you're 50 feet up a rock face, start worrying and ruminating about whether you paid the gas bill or not. If you're in the middle of a football game and someone's passing the ball, the crowds are cheering, you can't think about some remark your girlfriend made that pissed you off the day before. You are totally in the present. And sports are the principal way, I think, in the modern world in which people come completely into the present. Meditation is a slower process. But sports and moving spiritual practices like sacred dance, music, I think connects us with the dimension of spirit, the moving principle of ultimate reality. And I think aesthetic enjoyment, enjoying the beauty of flowers, the beautiful architecture of art, is more connecting with the logos or beauty aspect of spiritual reality. So these spiritual practices connect us in different ways with different aspects of this ultimate consciousness. I personally think that this is a better way of experiencing it. It's how I think of it myself. And I spent years as a card-carrying materialist and atheist. So I'm very familiar with that worldview. But if you want to stick to a materialist worldview and dismiss all these experiences as make-believe, then what you have to do is dismiss your own experience of consciousness, especially if you've had mystical experiences or senses of connection through spiritual practices, including psychedelics, which can provide spiritual openings. If you're going to dismiss your own experience in favour of the theory that is nothing but the activity of the brain, that consciousness isn't really doing anything, you're putting a theory ahead of your own experience. But since consciousness is experience, and since we're meant to be empirical, if we're going to be scientific, empiricism is experience, that's what it means in Greek. Empirical means experiential, to do with experience. You have to make a personal choice, so each one of us does, whether to put our own personal experience of these things, to pay more attention to that, especially when it gives us a sense of forms of consciousness beyond our own, or keep going back to materialist theory, it's nothing but the brain. The materialist theory, as I say, is brilliant for machines. It's not brilliant for understanding consciousness. It leads to the hard problem. And so it's not really the best theory in the world for explaining consciousness. It's probably the worst theory in the world for explaining it. Otherwise it wouldn't lead to the hard problem. But this is a question that lies before everybody today, because we're on the cusp, I think, between the paradigm shift from mechanistic materialism, which has dominated academic life in our society for decades, to a more rich view of nature as alive, a more panpsychist or animist view of the world, and a view of the world in which consciousness is more than just an activity in human brains, and it's an activity, greater forms of consciousness we can actually access through our own direct experience. The choice is up to each one of us, and we'll have to use both our rational minds and our experience in trying to decide between these different possibilities.
All right, so that's starting to shape up. Let me zoom in on that a little bit. We'll do another round.
We're now going to have a short break, 5 to 7 minutes is what Neil said, and then we'll have a session when there can be questions, answers, comments.
Rupert, hello. I don't know where to start really. I guess firstly an observation, and that is that I thought that you were going to sort of posit your theory of consciousness around morphic resonance, around the sense that consciousness is out there in the universe, and that in a sense, if I understand it correctly, you believe that you could say our brain's a bit more like a kind of radio. They sort of pick up a slice of that consciousness, which is unique to us. So I was kind of rather looking forward to you explaining that and explaining to us where your evidence for that is, and in particular why there isn't a published paper with this idea, which has been peer reviewed, by scientists. Because let's be really honest, and I'm really not trying to be unkind here, I'm trying to be truthful. Your ideas have been very shunned in the scientific community, and I sort of wondered what your reaction to that was. And my second question is really to ask you about your personal beliefs. And my understanding is that you're a Christian, and I completely respect and understand the human need for spirituality. I'm not just a materialist. But I'm wondering how you have come to the Christian way of explaining the world, and why that would be correct and not, for example, the Islamic or the Jewish or an atheist or Hindu or any other. So those two things really. Why didn't you talk about your actual central idea? And secondly, what are your personal beliefs?
Gosh, these are both huge questions.
But I think hugely relevant.
All right, yes, they are. They're very relevant. Well, first of all, I had intended to talk about morphic resonance in this talk, but I always speak from notes, and there just wasn't time. If I brought it up at all, I would have had to explain the whole theory, which would take at least 20 minutes. And since the title I was working on is the universe conscious, rather than does morphic resonance exist, that's what I was speaking about. I mean, I didn't make up the title. Neil, the Vice Chancellor of the Weekend University, gave me this title. And I wanted to talk about what the advertised title was. As it so happens, I am very interested in the question of, is the sun conscious? And in fact, right now, I'm writing a paper called Is the Sun Conscious for the Journal of Consciousness Studies, a peer-reviewed journal. I've written a lot of papers in peer-reviewed journals, including ones on morphic resonance. On my website there's dozens of, there's 90 papers altogether. Probably 6 or 7 on morphic resonance, quite a lot on telepathy, quite a number on other aspects of the extended mind. So I do publish in peer-reviewed journals. I do it out of a sense of duty, and so I don't do it because anyone actually reads the papers. Hardly anyone I know has read any of my papers in peer-reviewed journals. And so it's a more effective way of getting ideas across as books and talks. But they're all there for anyone who's interested, including empirical studies on morphic resonance, and many empirical studies on the nature of the mind, particularly the extended mind. I haven't talked today at all about all my work on telepathy, the extended mind, premonitions, unexplained powers of animals, hidden signals. I have to focus on something. The entire universe seemed to be enough for one afternoon. In terms of my own path, I went through, by the age of about 14, I became a fairly militant atheist, a pain in the thorn in the flesh of the chaplain of my Church of England school. And I was a sort of atheistic materialist for quite a long time, even until my 30s. Then I went to India. I travelled through India in 1968. I was working in Malaysia for a year. And I later in 1974 went to live in India, where I had a job there in an agricultural research institute. And travelling in Asia opened my mind to all sorts of other ways of looking at reality. I met perfectly rational Indians who thought in terms of the consciousness of Satchitananda, meditation, what's going on in that. So I became very influenced by the Hindu tradition. I had Hindu gurus, I did yoga, I did meditation. Then I had a Sufi teacher. I got interested in Sufism. I had some Muslim friends in Hyderabad, which is where I lived. I spoke Urdu. And I was drawn into a kind of Sufi world, which I found very attractive and interesting, and for a while had Sufi practices. And then I thought, well, there's no way I'm going to become a Sufi. The Sufi means you've got to become a Muslim first. And I didn't particularly want to have to fast in Ramadan and buy into the whole Quran. I had been circumcised, so that one of the main obstacles for people, the more painful aspect was all right. So I did seriously consider it for about 10 minutes. And then I thought, well, I can't really be a Hindu because, Hindus, there's so much about the land of India, the temples of India, the traditions of India. And I went to see a Hindu guru and asked his advice on the spiritual path. He said, well, you come from a Christian background, you should try being a good Christian. All paths lead to God. And, that's the one that's most natural for you, your own tradition. So I thought, well, I hadn't thought of that. I thought, okay. So I tried it out, and it worked very well for me. And then I met a wonderful Christian teacher, Father B. Griffiths, who lived in ashram, a Benedictine monk in an ashram in South India, where I spent some time. I wrote my first book in his ashram. And when I came back to England, I found reconnecting with the Christian tradition was really helpful. The great cathedrals, the holy places, the churches, the festivals, fasting and Lent, all these things made sense to me. But I'm not an evangelizing Christian in the sense I think everyone should be a Christian. I don't think they should. And no, I think Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists are fine the way they are. And if I'd been born in India, I'm sure I'd be a Hindu or a Muslim or whatever. But I'm English. I was born in England. This is the tradition of my ancestors and on morphic resonance principles. it's the one that works most naturally and easily for me. Well, this is another big question. I think that the doctrine of the nature of ultimate consciousness, the Holy Trinity, which is the Christian view of God, as I spoke about earlier, I think is a very good model. It's a metaphorical model of ultimate reality. Hindus and other religions have rather similar ones. A Trinitarian understanding, I think, is probably the best model we can have, whether you call it Snapship Amanda or Father, Son and Holy Spirit. So I think in that sense it's true, in the sense that it's a model about ultimate reality. It's probably as good as we can get. Obviously, by definition, an ultimate conscious mind that embraces the entire universe with billions of galaxies is likely to be beyond the grasp of our own very limited minds that have evolved through millions of years of sort of hunting and gathering and hundreds of thousands of years of making stone axes and things. I think it's likely to be a limited understanding. I think other aspects of the Christian story, I think religion's more about practice than truth, frankly. I mean, I pray, I meditate, I go to church services, I go on pilgrimages, I sing. These are all spiritual practices that give a sense of connection, and in that sense they're true. Now, whether or not Jesus was actually born on December the 25th in AD 0, it doesn't bother me much. I'm not very interested in those kinds of details. I'm more interested in the bigger picture and the practices. So I don't think everything in the Bible is literally true. Actually, most serious Christians throughout time have never thought that. It's only American fundamentalists who think that. So I don't think materialism is true. And I think it's actually false. I think that there are various religious approaches which are more appropriate for some people than others. So I'm not saying there is one truth and that this is it.
Where's that?
Thank you very much, Ruben. My question is, if natural laws, the laws of physics, laws of nature, are best understood as more as habits than laws, and if natural systems tend to be shaped by these natural habits or laws, reflecting on the points that you made in this book, that natural systems only tend to be conscious of that which they can choose between, and that habits themselves don't tend to be conscious. My question is, does choice itself necessarily lie outside the laws of nature?
All right, I hope that last segment was in focus. But I used a pretty thick glaze combo with the medium yellow to do the dots on top of the thin glaze of the orange, which starts bringing out the little points of yellow that sort of festoon the interior of the sunflower bulb or blossom. I think that's it for the moment, though. I was going to continue with her skin tones, but I think I'm just going to do this step on this one today. So thanks for watching. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting contact. Have a good afternoon, Earth.
So I think that the habits of nature are largely